Welcome back to another Pirkei Avot text explication with me, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. We are in the second chapter and now on to the 13th. That's right, the 13th text in the second chapter of Pirkei Avot. We have seen for the last three videos, the last three texts, that we have been hearing from the disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So these are all late first century sages. We had before this Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. We heard from the text identifying his five disciples, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai briefly described each of them, and now they are all speaking about three different things. Sometimes advice, sometimes not necessarily advice, just descriptions about the world. This tripartite aspect harkens back to what we had seen stylistically in the first chapter. That's really how the first chapter had operated. Many statements being in threes. Of course, at the end of the first chapter and the beginning of the second chapter, the text really departed from this tripartite structure. But with these five disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, we have seen a return to this style. Now we are on to the fourth of these five disciples. This is Rabbi Shimeon ben Netanel. So Rabbi Simon, son of Nathaniel. Now, just to give a little context, what we had heard from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in describing Rabbi Shimeon ben Netanel as simply Yirei Chet, that he is a sin-fearer. So he fears sin. So it might give a nice little character context to Rabbi Shimeon ben Netanel. So here are his three. It's interesting because the first and the third are fairly brief, not super brief, not super terse, but also at the same time not particularly lengthy. The middle of these three, however, it's an interesting sandwich. That is significantly lengthy. But here's the first one. Be careful with the reading of the Shema and with prayer. Be careful with reading Shema and prayer. Unclear what aspects are needing to be taken care of. Is the care that needs to be taken just to make sure that one says it? Because one could, forget perhaps to say the Shema, perhaps forget to actually pray. Maybe that's what it means. But maybe it also means someone is going to pray. Someone is going to say Kriyat Shema. Is it to be careful of the right setting? Is it to be careful of the right mindset? Is it to be careful of what one is doing? It's incredibly vague, to be honest, but be careful with it. The second, and I mentioned, this is kind of a sandwich because the second one is lengthy. Here we go. And when you pray, so back on the prayer topic, when you pray, and we already know to be careful, so what more is there to be said? Do not make your prayer set. Rather, make it a plea for compassion before the omnipresent, blessed be He. Make it. It's interesting. The Hebrew is rachamim v'tachanunim. In the English translation in front of me is a plea for compassion. So be compassionate. Make it compassionate and supplicatory. So rachamim, which is mercy, and tachanunim, there's like supplication. So make it merciful, or ask for mercy, ask supplications. You're asking for things in front of God, as it is said, and he quotes from the book of Joel, Ki chanun vrachum hu erech apayim v'rav chesed v'nicham ahal ra. For he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in kindness, and renouncing punishment. That's interesting. He's quoting this description of God from the book of Joel, a prophetic book. It's part of the Hebrew Bible, part of the Jewish Bible, because God is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in kindness, and renouncing punishment. Chanun vrachum, he's erech apayim v'rav chesed, and he does. So it's five different things. I don't know why Rabbi Shimeon ben Netanel does not mention each of all these five, just one. Actually two, chanun vrachum, the first two out of these five. Unclear, but the key piece is actually not to make our prayers set, but to have them to be asking for mercy, asking for other things to be supplicatory. I also think this was back in the times where the actual text itself was less set. later on throughout like I said, this is the end of the first century. Maybe as we turn into the beginning of the second century, these sages exist. So it definitely was a less of a set text versus what we have these days. Especially, we have printed sidurim, we have printed prayer books, which this was centuries prior to the advent of the printing press. Okay, but he ultimately says, make it something that's meaningful for you. Ask something from God. Okay. The third and final, we go back to something shorter, and this has nothing to do with prayer. Okay, this is not prayer related at all. Do not be wicked. V'al tehi rasha bifnei atzmecha. Do not be wicked to yourself. That's interesting. Do not be wicked bifnei atzmecha. In sort of like how you see yourself. Don't perceive yourself to be wicked. This is such a really fascinating. Obviously, the first two aspects of his advice here, of a more prayer nature, right? This one has nothing to do with prayer, and in fact, really isn't specific to Judaism or anything to do with that. This is something that's a more universal human concern. Don't perceive yourself to be so wicked. Really interesting. It's a very different thing than one might have expected, which is, don't think you're so great. This is the exact opposite. Don't think you're so wicked. I think this is really fascinating. And I think this is an interesting safeguard for when we can perceive ourselves to just be, we could potentially see ourselves as bad or awful or, having various negative character traits. And he says, really? You're better than this. And I think he's really pushing us in this one to not consider ourselves wicked at whatever points that we may have moments of weakness and how we consider ourselves, but to really think about who we are, what we do, and I think it's really pushing us to aspirationally be better and do good things in the world. And I think that's a really fascinating thing. Don't think you're so wicked. So, in sum, Rabbi Shimeon ben Netanel, Rabbi Simon, the son of Nathaniel, says, be careful with prayer and Kriyat Shema. When you pray, do it with mercy and compassion. Don't make it so set. Mercy and compassion before the omnipresent, before God. And finally, this is really intriguing, don't think you're so wicked and now I'm just making my own thing here, which is because it could turn you down a darker path. So, you're still a good person. All right. Thank you so much for watching.